Welcome back, part 3 in the Incra joint series. Today's the turn of the half-blind dovetail, and we're making another box, this time somewhere to store my screwdrivers. That sounds interesting. Stick around. Today we're making yet another box. This time it's a box to store the various screwdrivers that you tend to collect over time, and you pretty much need them on every job, whether it's a screwdriver just to adjust the Incra fence, or the screwdriver to adjust one of the Festool tools, or just a normal screwdriver to put a screw in. At the moment my screwdrivers just tend to sit on one of the shelves on the not yet completed bookcase, and I want to give them a bit more of a home. But this episode is not really about storage of screwdrivers, it's about that half-blind dovetail on the Incra fence. If you've seen any of my Incra joint series so far, you'll begin to see there's repetition in each one, and that's deliberate, because what I want to do is to have videos that are standalone items. So if you just want to know how to do a half-blind dovetail, this is the video for you, and all the information you need will be self-contained inside this video, so you don't need to go around watching lots of other videos to get the knowledge that you need. So by now you'll recognize this rather large red manual that comes with the Incra fence, and as we've said many times, it's so big because at the back of the manual it has the full size templates that we're going to use to build our joints. If you buy the metric version, which is the kit you'll tend to get in Europe, it will also come with a black and white version. It's pretty much the same, but obviously in metric. And this replicates all the templates that you need, but this time obviously in metric. So the manual gives us quite a lot of information. It introduces the Incra fence system, and it shows you how to set things up, how to center material, how to line your joints up for a good fit. And it then talks you through each of the type of joints that you can do in turn. Talk about the box joints that we looked at episode 1 in this series. Talks about the through dovetails that we looked at in episode 2 of this series. And it talks about the half-blind dovetails that we're going to look at in this episode. It goes, as always, it goes through a lot of details of how we're going to make the joint itself. And importantly to us, a quick step guide that takes us through 8 key things that we need to do to make this joint. And that's useful because once you've got it inside your head, if you're doing this all the time, every single day, it becomes second nature. But like most weekend woodworkers, if you come back to this every now and then, you need that refresh. But you don't need all the details, so the quick step guide gives you what you need. So I take the quick step guide one step further, and I create these simple cheat sheets that gives me the dimensions of the thing I'm building, some key information I need to record, and then quick step by step of what we need to do to make these joints. And these are available to you if you want to use them free of charge on the website www.thewoodgrafter.com. They're all in Word format, so please go along, download them, help yourself, change them, update them. It's just a good guide to help you through this system. So the first thing I want to do is to work out some rough dimensions for this box. So these are the things that I want to keep inside my box. Pair of long nose pliers, some standard screwdrivers, some braddles, and these hex screwdrivers that are used on both the Festool systems and the Incra fence system. And they'll all fit into the box, something nicely like that. So the overall length of my box needs to accommodate the longest item in here, which is probably this black screwdriver that's used on the Incra fence. So this needs to be at least 240 millimeters. So we'll go ahead and we'll make this 300, and that will give me quite a nice clearance for this screwdriver. So the internal dimensions of my side are going to be 300 millimeters, and the internal dimensions of the box, we'll call it somewhere around about 130 millimeters. 130 millimeters. This is a stock that we're going to use, and as always it's just cheap pine from the local big box store. It's around about 92 millimeters in width, It's 15, nominal 15 millimeters thick, and it comes in 2.5 meter strips. So ideally the desired depth of this project is going to be this material, and therefore that is 92 millimeters, and the stock thickness is 15 millimeters. Now we've got some basic information about our project. It's now time to look at the Incra templates, those full-size templates that came inside the book, to work out what we're going to use for those dovetails. And you may have heard me say, maybe once or twice, that the one part of the Incra system I'm not 100% in love with is just the templates that dictate the final size of the stock, not the design considerations that I would normally work to. So let's delve into those templates and see what we can see. First part of the template guide is looking at metric box joints. I'm not interested in those because we are doing blind dovetails. So I'm going to flick through to the section around dovetails, and that starts on page 6. Metric dovetail joint templates. Now these templates work for both through dovetails and for blind dovetails. So we've got quite a large selection here. It starts at template A and it goes all the way through to template K. So that's about what, 11 templates we have to choose from. Now what you're looking at here is the grey areas is the material that's left over once you've made the joints, and the white area is the material that you cut out when you make the joint. And you have two versions of the template, version A and version B. One of these will cut the tails and one of these will cut the pins, and we need to establish which is which as we go through the project. You can see down here there's some key information that's provided by the template. Talks about a unique template name, the bit type that we use, the approximate depth of cut, the spacing to work out your depth of cut, suggested center on the template, an approximate rebate or rabbet width, and importantly at this stage of the game, the approximate stock thickness. And you can see it's giving me a stock thickness for both half blind dovetails and through dovetails. In this example, template A, my half blind dovetail stock is 8 to 10 millimeters and my through stock is 6 millimeters. So we want to find the templates that allow for that 15 millimeter stock, that half blind range, 15 somewhere inside that range. So you can see that template A is no good to us, it's 8 to 10. Similarly, template B is no good to us, it's 8 to 10. Similarly, template C is no good to us, it's 10 to 14. Similarly, template D is no good to us, it's 10 to 14. Template E is 10 to 14. Template F is 14 to 18, so template F is an option. Template G is 14 to 18, so template G is an option. Template H is an option, and then template I onwards is 18 millimeter stock and above. So we have a choice of template H, template F, or template G. So straight away we've taken all those numerous templates that are in the book, we've got rid of all the box ones, we're not using them, we've got rid of all those that aren't the right stock, and we've narrowed it down to 3 templates. So that book is not quite as complicated as it seems. And also one of the big selling points of the Incra is the vast amount of templates that you can use. In reality, we've got 3. And when we did the through dovetails, we had 2 for our 15 millimeter stock. We know that the desired depth is set by the stock at the moment, which is 92 millimeters. Now each of these marks, 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A, shows the center point of where the router bit will remove stock. And similarly on this B, 1B, 2B and 3B shows a center point of where the router bit will remove stock when we come to the final joinery. You can see that my 92 mark is going to end round about here. Now ideally when I lay my dovetails out, I want a half pin on either side of my pin board, and a half pin is exactly what it says, it's half of one of these grey areas. Now half of that grey area there lines up with the tails, the 7A, 8A, etc. increments. So I want to measure between these to find where I've got a good half pin. So you can see that the half pin dimensions on this material is 100 millimeters and we need 92. So without changing my stock size, F is no good for me. G also gives me a centre point of round about 105, so again G is not that good for me. And H gives me a centre point of 90, so actually H is looking pretty good. And given that's only a millimetre either side and it's a nominal 92, in reality it's probably nearer to 91, this would look quite good out of the box. So I think we're going to go for template H in this place. So just check, yes, 15mm is between 14 and 18. My 92mm stock will more or less fit on these centre points, giving me a half pin at either end of my pin board. So remarkably, H looks pretty good without changing the dimensions of my stock. If you couldn't fit that in, exactly the same situation we had on the through dovetails, you now need to reduce the size of your stock to fit the template. The template's designing the project for you, not your design considerations. And that's a constraint that you have to decide whether you want to live with or not. So now, having decided on our template, we now need to capture some information about this template. Well, the first thing I want to do is to capture the template name, and we know it's MODVH, so we'll write that in here, MODVH. Now each template also comes with a unique number, and in this case it's template number 15. MODVH15, MODV, metric dovetail, template H15, that's what that lot means. Perfect. The next thing I want to do is look at my approximate depth of cut. Now my approximate depth of cut for this template is 11mm, so we'll capture 11mm. I now want to work out my recommended spacing for my depth of cut, and my spacing to set the depth of cut is 20mm, so I now put that there as well. I now need to find my suggested centre, and my suggested centre for this template is 8A. Here you can see there's a black and white version of the template we're going to use, and you can see on here there's a point 8A that lines up with 8A on this template here, and that's the centre point that we're talking about, so we capture the centre point being 8A. There's now something called a rebate width or a rabbit width, and on this one it's 6mm, and we'll capture that and we'll come back to the purpose of that on blind dovetails shortly. Then I want to talk about the bit details, and my bit type is a 1/2 inch 14° dovetailing bit. 1/2 inch 14° dovetail bit. Now you may have just noticed that we've just quoted the dovetail in inches, 1/2 inch dovetail cutter. For some reason, even on the metric system, Incra quote the dovetail in inches. Everything else is in metric. Even the box cutters are quoted in millimeters, but those dovetails are always in imperial. What I did, I invested in a set of router bits by Whiteside, and these bits are actually designed to be used with the Incra metric system. And when you open up the kit, you have 6 router bits that are the most common choices that you would use, so you can make the majority of the templates in this. The 2 box cutters are in millimeters, and the 4 dovetail cutters are all quoted in imperial. So it's as easy as saying I need the 1/2 inch 14° cutter, which is this one here. So that's how I got round that problem. So I don't need to convert 1/2 inch to millimeters, I just look in my Whiteside kit and choose the router bit that we need. The next thing I want to work out is what my actual depth is from the template, because we know our desired depth was 92mm, and on template H we could bring this down to 90mm, but to be honest with you, that millimetre either side is not going to affect too much, so I'm going to leave my stock as is at 92mm. Now the next measurement we need is the actual router bit height, and we take that as a measurement from the router table once we work out and dial in these joints. Everything else on here is now calculated, and we'll come back to these measurements once we've got the table set up. Now the next thing I need to do is to set up the table before I can calculate the final sizes of the stock, and we'll come back to that calculation in a second. What I need to set the table up are 2 scrap pieces of wood. They need to be the same width, 92mm, and the same thickness, 15mm, that we're going to use on the final project. So I'm going to go and cross-cut some of that from my material. We'll come back together and set up the table. So I've dropped the 1/2 inch router bit into the table, and you'll notice I'm going to use an oversized insert around that router bit, and that's to aid with dust collection. When we're making these dovetails, there's nothing to take the dust away, and it tends to collect here on the table and make a mess of my floor. And plus, I don't really want airborne particles in my shop. So using an oversized insert allows the dust extraction under the table to take the majority of the debris away. Makes no difference to the joint, just aids in dust collection. We now need to set this to an approximate height. If you remember when we captured the information, there was an approximate depth of cut that in our case was 11mm. So we are going to set this to 11mm. So I've just zeroed down my digital calipers, and that's 11.24, so obviously we just need to wind that down a little bit. There you go, 11mm. I now want to make a test cut, so I'm going to bring in the Incra fence, and I'm just going to by eye line it up to the centre of the router bit. So by lining it up, I'm just going to sight down the fence here, and I just want that to be round about there. So half the router bit is now sticking out on this joint, and for this measurement for through dovetails, this is known as the 0 point. I now want to capture that 0 point, so I'm just going to use this blue scale and put the 0 directly under the crosshair on my fence, which is there. So we now come in with the right angled fence, and we need to clamp this material square to that fence, this being our scrap stock. So this is as good a time as any as talking about our clamping procedure. At the back of the sled there are 3 nylon screws. You want to adjust the outside 2 nylon nuts until this sits square to the fence, but still allows you to move backwards and forwards quite smoothly. The middle nut is a locking nut, and as you tighten that down, it just locks this into position so it can't move forward or backwards. Now in practice, this is not quite as stable as it looks. It's got the tendency of tipping backwards and forwards, and there's also a slight bit of play left to right as well, and either of that can knock you out of square. For the Incra fence to work effectively, you've got to ensure that everything stays square, and if that's tipping forward, it's going to knock us out of square. So every time that we need to put some stock against this fence to make a cut, we need to go through a clamping procedure. Ensure that your stock is prepared well, it's flat and it's square. Bring the carriage back so it's approaching this finger hole here that we use for changing the module on the CMS. Use the middle nut and just lock that into position so it's stable. Come in with one of these type of festool clamps into that finger hole, and then just clamp that into position. What you've now done is you've clamped this fence square to the table, and you've clamped the right angle fence square to the fence here as well. You can then come along and put in your material, and you should have no gaps down this back edge here, and you should be flush to this table here. That's now set at right angles to the fence, which is what you need, of course. You now need to clamp this material to this fence. In the box joint video, if you saw that one, I used one of these quick clamps, the Irwin quick clamps, and that was okay because the box cutter doesn't put much stress on this. However, because I'm using a router bit, that puts more stress on this, more torque, trying to twist this material out of true. Therefore, I need more clamping pressure than I can get with a quick clamp. For that reason, Incra recommend the use of one of these traditional wooden clamps, and to be honest with you, I agree with them. They're a bit clunky to use, but once you get them locked in, they really do give you great clamping pressure. So make sure everything's square, everything's flush to the fences, and tighten this down. And once that's tight, this is not going anywhere. At that point, you can release your back nylon nut, take away your festool clamp, and this should now work pretty well for you. So, with our fence zeroed to the centre point of the router bit and the scale at the back set to 0 for reference point, everything squared, everything clamped in, I'm now going to take the first pass across this router bit. When we captured the information, we also had a recommended spacing for the depth of cut measurement, and in our case that was 20 millimeters. We now use that 20 millimeters to move this fence backwards by 20. Luckily, we set a 0 point up at 0, so we can now just simply slide the fence back to that 20 millimeter mark, which is there, and now I can make a set and cut across our material. Now you can see I've ended up with 2 dovetails. We now need to fit that together. What we're looking for is a tight fit here, and you can see that this will actually move backwards and forwards. So there's a slight gap just here in the joints. I therefore need to raise this router bit, and the way to remember it is heighten to tighten, lower to loosen. So I want to tighten that joint up, so I want to heighten this, and I want to raise this by the amount of gap there. So you can see it's very, very, very small. So I'm going to put a cross on both of these to tell me that they were of no use to me whatsoever. It's very easy to get confused because we're now going to raise this probably by a quarter of a turn to close that gap and then make another test cut. Now you can see that that joint's gone together, but it was probably a little bit too tight. It's made a nice joint, but maybe too tight. So I'm just going to back this off a hair and I'll call that good. I now want to measure the actual height to see where we ended up. So I'm just going to 0 this in again, and our final measurement was 11.79, so we'll call that 11.8. So the actual router bit height measured after setup is 11.8 millimeters. So I can now calculate the dovetail, what I'm calling the dovetail offset, which is my stock thickness minus the actual router bit height. And let me explain that further. Now you can see that when you make a through dovetail, the top part of your joint on both sides is flush with the end of the stock. So the depth of your dovetail is the same as the thickness of your overall stock. In a blind dovetail, you have to allow for the thickness of the material. And you can see that this board here, the lighter colour board, does not end flush with the material. It's offset a little bit. Now that material left over is dictated on the Incra system by the depth of your router cutter, which was 11.8 millimeters. So this will come through the stock of 11.8 millimeters, so the piece left over is the thickness of the stock minus 11.8, and that's what I'm calling the offset. So we know we've got 15 millimeters stock, so 15 minus 11.8 is 3.2. So the thickness of this stock here is going to be 3.2 millimeters. So I can now measure the dovetail offset, which is the stock thickness minus the actual router bits. 15 minus 11.8 is 3.2. Now in our example, we're going to make the front of the box the pin board. So the tails are going to be on the side of the box. So I know I want my length to be 300, but I need to allow for this offset. So 300 minus 3.2 minus 3.2 gives me the length of the material, and when the box is assembled, it'll give me that overall length of 300. So 300 minus 6.4 is 293.6. With that said, let's go back to the template and work out whether it's the A cuts or the B cuts, the tails or the pins. So we said earlier on that we're going to be using template H, and we know that the grey area is the material that's left and the white area is the material we're going to cut out of our stock. We also know we had a centre point of 8A, which is here on the stock. I want to find the centre point of my material. So we know this material is 92 millimeters in width, so the centre point is going to be 46. So I just want to make a mark here, 46 millimeters, which is there. I can now line up that centre point on my centre point of the template, 8A, and what I'm looking for is which of these templates, A or B, leaves some meat on the edge. So you can see if I'm using this piece of material centred around here, then I'm going to end up with this grey piece on my material. So I'm going to end up with a half pin here on my material. You could see if I'm still centred up around the 8A, then here I'm going to end up with a gap at the end of my material where the router bit cuts through. If I have a gap at the ends, then that is cutting the tails. If I have material at the ends, then that is cutting the pins. So in our configuration, A template is going to leave me material, so the A template is cutting my pins. So I know that my A is my pins. I know that my B cut is leaving a gap at the end, so my B cut is cutting the tails. So I've cut my stock down to size, and you can start to see the assembly coming together. Now there's no stresses and strains on this box, so it doesn't actually matter what we're using as the tails and the pins, so it's purely visual. But let's think about this for a second. If that was my pin board and this was my tail board, I always assemble a joint tails into the pins. So the joint is stronger in this direction. That will resist this material pulling off the end of this material. And that's why you see in drawer construction, this being the pin board and these being the tail boards. So you always want to work out where the stresses and strains are. So in a drawer, you're always pulling the joint this way as you're opening the drawer. This box, it doesn't matter, but visually, I'm going to make these shorter ends my pin boards, and these longer pieces my tail boards. So we know that the A is the pin board and the B is the tail board, and I know my shorter ends are going to be my pin boards. So I can come along and I can write on the outside face, you're a pin and you're going to be cut by A. Similarly, on the back one, you're a pin and you're going to be cut by A. My side ones, you're a tail and you're going to be cut by B. You're a tail and you're going to be cut by B. So I know now my outside edges, the purpose of the material and the template I'm going to be using to cut. The final thing that I like to do is just to work out where the top of my board actually is. So I can just write top on here, and that's just to help me assemble things in the right direction. I'm going to work on the tail boards first of all, tail B and tail B. Now, because of the way this joint comes together, we have to make a rebate joint or a rabbet joint down the back of this board, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we come to assemble the joint, and you can see the reasons why. So job one is to make this rebate down the back. When we took our measurements, there was a strange sounding measurement that was called the suggested rebate width, and that suggested rebate width was 6 millimeters. So what I want to do is to set up my fence for a 6 millimeter rebate on the rear, the inside of the joint. We know this is the face because we marked it, so this must be the inside edge. To set this up, we bring this up to create what we call a scoring pass, and a scoring pass is purely to stop tear out in the material. To create the scoring pass, come in with a straight edge, and at the widest part of the router bit cut, don't forget that slope so it's at the top not the bottom, just bring your fence up and lock that into position. Then with the incremental adjuster, just take that back 1 or 2 clicks. It doesn't matter how many clicks, you're just looking for the outside cutting edge to be slightly proud by a few thousand millimeter from the face frame here. I want to reference that point so I can come back to it, so I now take my blue scale and I zero that in under the crosshair, which is about there. I'm now going to make a scoring pass on all 4 inside edges of my tail boards. And all I'm looking for is that fine line to be made on the back of my board. With that done, I'm now going to creep up to that recommended rebate distance, and if you remember, that was 6mm. So I'll come into halfway, and we'll come into, say, 3mm, and I'll lock that in place, and I'll now make a second pass. And what we end up with is this half dovetail shaped rebate 6mm deep on the back of the board with a reasonably crisp shoulder line here. This is the template that we're going to use. It's MDOVH unique number 15, and this is what the template looks like, and you can see the red cuts that we have and then the blue cuts that we know we're going to need. And this template just simply slots into any of these rails in the fence. There's a direction of travel, there's an arrow, so make sure that we insert it with the arrow facing in the right direction. Arrow goes towards the fence. We then need to set the center point of the template to the center point of the stock. So we come back in with our stock, and do you remember that center point that we found earlier on when we were working out what were the tails and the pins? Take that center point of the stock and just by eye line that center point up with the center point of the router. Bring your fence in and lock it into place. We are now going to take a pass through the full length of the stock, turn it round and take a second pass, and then we can eyeball up the router bit against the channel that we've just made and then adjust the fence for centre. And now we can eyeball down the table, and we're looking at this gap on this side here and this gap on this side here, and obviously we want the two gaps to be equal. So I think my stock needs to go in that direction ever so slightly. So we can use the incremental adjuster to just centre that stock. At that point we know that the fence is holding the stock in a central position and the stock is centred to the centre point of the router bit, and that looks good. So now we're looking for the suggested centre that was 8A, and we're going to put that 8A under the hairline on our fence, which is there. So everything's now centred up. The template's centred to my fence is centred to my stock, and my stock is centred to the centre point of the router bit. Good to go. We're now going to go ahead and make the tail cuts. We clamp the material face sides together, so the rebates we made are facing away from each other. Keep ourselves referenced to our tops and put that against the fence. Don't forget your backer board. We want to make sure we don't get any tear out on this, and clamp all this into position. So we want to make sure that everything's nice and flat to the bottom, and looking down this face here, everything is nice and flush to here. Notice I put the clamp on this side this time. I just find that easier. It tends to push the material into this bottom corner. Clamping on this side tends to push it away. It's just one of those things that I find easier. Once we're happy with that, we can now release the right angle sled, and that should move easily. What we're now going to do, we'll make a zero cut, and that zero cut there is just going to define the shoulder of the joint, the shoulder on the tailboards. We'll then do 27, 26 and 25B on the blue cuts. We'll then move over and we'll do the same. We'll go to the next B cut, which is 24, lock it in, make the B cut, then we'll make 23, then we'll make 22, and we'll keep doing that until we've worked right across the face of the material. Then turn the boards over and repeat the cuts on the other side. And then this is what we end up with. We end up with these rather nice dovetail pins here, and you can see at the back we have this rather interesting sloped profile here at the back, and you'll see the point of that in a second. So the next job is we're going to cut the pin boards A, and we cut these with the faces up flat onto the table, so it's somewhat easier. We're now going to use the shop stop that came with the kit, and I'm going to bring the stop up until it's just resting on that cutter bit there. and then lock that into place. I'm now going to raise up the arm until it's higher than the cutter but slightly lower than my material, and that is going to be round about there. Bring my fence in to the 0 cut and identify my first pin cut, in this case 9A, and lock into that position. And now I come in and make a cut, so my stop references on to the shop stop point. Then move this to the next cut, which in that case will be 8A, and work across the board. And then try your fit. Now this joint should go together pretty easily. So you can see now that we've got this nice blind dovetail joint beginning to appear. But you can also see that these are ever so slightly proud. So we need to increase the depth of cut in the pin board itself, and we do that by moving this back. Now we only want to move it back by that amount there, which is not an awful lot. So for that we use this top block here, undo the black ones, and then just back off this a couple of turns. Probably try about there. And that now looks pretty good to me. We've got a nice tight flush joint. So I'm going to cut all the pin boards at that depth, and then we can assemble this thing. So you can see what you end up with. You end up with this slight curved hole here, and that is actually sloping down inside the joint. So the profile of these is also sloping down inside the joint. It's not curved, but it does tend to fit. So with that done, we can now just go ahead and assemble this. And that's looking pretty good. Joints look nice and tight, everything seems to be nice and square, and you get that nice contrast. So yeah, so now we can put the base in this, glue it and sand it, and job's a good one. So there we go, another over-engineered box from the Woodgrafter workshop. This time over-engineered to take a few screwdrivers. But again, it was about the joinery, it's not about the box. And if you can see, these have come out really, really well. That's a really nice joint. There's a smallest amount of tear outs at the very, very top of these pins, and therefore that still wouldn't be quite good enough to go on the furniture projects that I do. But it is a neat job, and it looks quite good. This is very cheap pine stacked high and dry inside my local big box store, and it comes slightly warped and bent and twisted, and I didn't do any stock preparation at all. I just ripped this to length and made a box out of it. So I guess I can forgive the jig a little bit for the tear out. And if I had quality stock like the thing I'm using on the bookcase behind us, and took my time to make sure everything was perfectly squared and those edges were square, probably using my shooting board, not just relying on the Capex cut, they'll come out pretty much bang on, and that would be cabinet quality. So that's it. We've got an over-engineered box that can now be the home of my various screwdriver type things, and I've got somewhere to keep them now. That concludes the series on the Incra joint. We've covered the box joint, the through dovetail and the blind dovetail in this series. We will be revisiting the series in the future, looking at the double dovetails and the double dovetails, but for that I want a higher quality of stock, probably contrasting stock, and I've got some cherry and ash that I think will make a pleasing contrast to really showcase those joints. For that, of course, I want to do sensible, strong, good stock preparation, and I'll need a planer jointer for that. So that's as far as we can go today in the series. Look out for that advanced series coming soon. I hope this has been useful. Leave your comments, get in touch. Don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.